Evan rubbed his temples, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop. The document on the screen was blank and had been there for hours. He tried to focus, but his mind became static, as though his thoughts were drowned out by a low hum he couldn't pinpoint. The simple task of sitting down to write, a routine he used to enjoy, had become increasingly unbearable for weeks. Evan felt it all the time now. An intruding presence, like someone or something, was living just behind his eyes, watching, waiting. It started innocently enough. Forgotten keys, lost wallet, absent-mindedly walking into a room and forgetting why. But those little lapses of memory quickly gave way to something more sinister. Things moved. Objects appeared in places they shouldn't have been. His phone was in the freezer one day. His shoes lined up perfectly outside the front door, despite his habit of leaving them wherever he kicked them off. Sleep, once his escape from the daily grind, turned into a nightly ordeal. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, gasping for breath. His dreams were always the same, a cold, featureless room, its walls stark white, and in the corner stood a figure, faceless, unmoving, yet oppressive, as if its very presence sucked the air from the room. The figure never spoke, but somehow Evan knew it was waiting for him. He tried to shake off the dreams as stress-induced. His job had become more demanding, and he'd always dealt with anxiety in strange ways. But this felt different. It felt real, tangible. Last night the figure moved. He was standing in the corner of the room, watching Evan with eyes that didn't exist. It whispered his name. Evan! He woke up, standing in the hallway outside his apartment, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He couldn't remember how he got there. Now, as he sat at his desk, his laptop illuminating the dark room, Evan couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had followed him out of the dream. You're tired, aren't you? The voice wasn't his own, though it came from within his mind. It felt wrong, too close, too intimate. Evan froze, his fingers hovered over the keyboard, his breath shallow. You've been fighting for so long, why not rest? The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it that made his skin crawl. He shook his head, trying to dispel the voice out. But it lingered, its presence growing stronger with each passing moment. He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. His heart pounded in his chest as he paced the room, his mind racing. For days he had felt like he was losing control over his life, thoughts, and actions. He had lashed out at friends, sent messages he forgot to type, and picked fights with strangers. Each time it happened, a wave of nausea came over him, followed by a strange sense of exhilaration. It was as if something deep within him craved the chaos. You don't need them. You don't need anyone. You're stronger than this. The voice whispered again, more insistent now. He pressed his hands against his ears as if trying to block out the sound. It was useless. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, deep within his mind. The figure from his dreams. He could feel it now, more than ever. It was here, with him, not just in his dreams, but in his waking hours too. And it wasn't leaving. Evan tried to resume his regular, normal routine over the next few days, but things continued to spiral. He lost chunks of time, hours disappearing without remembering what he had been doing. He'd wake up in strange places, sometimes standing in the middle of the street, sometimes sitting in his car with the engine running. Each time his mind would blur, and his body drained like something had been feeding on his energy. His friends had noticed the change. Sarah, one of his closest, cornered him after work one evening.
You're not yourself,
she said, concern etched on her face.
You've been distant, moody. I don't know what's happening, but you need help, Evan.
He wanted to tell her. He wanted to scream that something was wrong, that he wasn't alone in his own mind. The words wouldn't come out. Instead, he smiled, too wide, too forced.
I'm fine,
he said, though the voice inside him mocked him even as he spoke. That night he dreamed again. The white room was colder this time, the walls closing in. The figure stood closer, its form more defined, though its face was still a dark void. This time when it spoke, it was in his own voice, twisted and distorted. Why do you fight me? Evan tried to run, but his legs refused to move, as if his body were paralyzed, trapped in the suffocating silence of the room. The figure took a step forward, then another, until it was inches from him. Its breath, cold and sharp, rattled in his ears. You're weak. You've always been weak, but
but I can make you strong.
The words resonated through him, vibrating deep in his bones. He wanted to resist, to push it away, but a part of him, a dark, hidden part, was listening. He had always felt like he didn't belong, like he was out of step with the world. He had always been searching for something more. The figure knew that. It knew Evan. Evan woke, his chest heaving. This time was different. His room felt smaller and more claustrophobic. His limbs felt heavier and his mind quiet. Too quiet. The voice wasn't whispering anymore. It was gone, but its absence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. Evan should have been relieved, but a deep sense of dread settled over him. It was waiting, watching. He didn't go to work that day. He couldn't. Instead, he spent hours sitting on the couch, staring at the wall, his mind chaotic, half-formed thoughts and fragmented memories. Every so often his body would twitch, an involuntary jerk. By late afternoon, the voice returned.
It's time, Evan. Time to let go.
This time there was no resistance. The voice didn't coax or seduce. It commanded. And Evan felt something deep within him start to unravel. He stood and walked to the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. His face was the same, but his eyes, they weren't. They were cold, empty, devoid of the spark of life that had always been there. Evan touched his face, but the movement didn't feel like his own. It felt detached, as a puppet, being controlled by invisible strings. His hand moved to the side of his head, fingers digging into his scalp as if trying to pull something out. He let out a low groan, a sound that didn't feel like it belonged to him. The voice laughed. Over the next week, Evan lost more of himself. His thoughts grew hazy and fragmented. The voice no longer whispered. It spoke freely now, dictating his every move. It told him what to say, what to do. He obeyed. He was no longer in control. He knew it, but he couldn't stop it. His body had become a shell, his mind a cage, trapped, a prisoner within his own skin. There were moments when he tried to fight back, to reclaim some sense of self. But each time the voice grew louder, angrier.
Why do you resist? You wanted this.
And maybe that was true. Deep down, maybe Evan had always wanted to escape, to be free from the weight of his existence. But now he realized too late that what he had wanted wasn't freedom. It was oblivion. One night, as Evan stared into the mirror again, his reflection wasn't just staring back at him. It was smiling, a cruel, twisted smile that didn't belong to him. The figure from his dreams had finally crossed over. He could feel it now, fully awake inside him, pushing him further into the dark recesses of his own mind. He was nothing more than a passenger, watching helplessly as the thing inside him took over completely.
I'm here now,
The voice said, its tone triumphant.
and you're nothing.
Evan's lips curled into a grin, but it wasn't his own. His hands moved, but he wasn't controlling them. The thing inside him was in command now, fully and completely. As he stared at his reflection, the last remnants of himself slipping away, Evan understood one final horrifying truth. He had been taken, not by force, but by surrender. And now it was too late to stop it. To be continued. Make sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when Part 2 is released later this week.